HSPs can be really powerful critical thinkers, and where better than to think critically than about all of these like issues that relate
Yeah.
to equity and equality and
Mm-hmm.
diversity and inclusiveness. So I think our minds are very useful here.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, and so maybe it is important. I love to use that word. It's like, how do we call upon our resilience in these times?
Mm-hmm. Welcome to Sensitive Stories. This episode is for educational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for treatment with a mental health or medical professional. Let's dive in. Brian, can you start off by telling us a little bit about how and when you discovered that you're highly sensitive?
I think it was Alanis Morissette's podcast. If you haven't
Oh.
heard it, everybody should listen. But a lot of great thinkers and psychotherapy thinkers on there, and so I heard it there, and yeah, I just remember them going into detail about all of the traits of being an HSP, and there was a lot that just like connected at a time. You know, uh, that was really important for me. I mean, it's also important to know that I was in grad school for clinical
Mm.
psychology at the time, and I was, you're learning so much at the time. I'm sure you're aware. And I remember getting really interested in highly sensitive people and all the sort of academic and scientific research behind it. That's where I really got excited about it. And then at the time, I was looking at parallels between, you know, being highly sensitive and what it meant to be a LGBTQ plus person
Mm.
in this world. And I remember doing research and writing something about that, just kind of diving in and looking at those parallels. And no one had ever researched the two before simultaneously,
Mm-hmm.
so they kind of all found each other at that time. And then, um, yeah, I really stepped into understanding and claiming HSP as like a part of my identity.
Mm. I love that you
Yeah,
claimed it.
yeah. It shifted here and there over time, but I remember in the beginning it was. Um, I couldn't know enough. I wanted to be in the community.
Mm-hmm.
I was looking for it to be affirmed in so many ways. So,
Mm.
I think like it settled down a little bit, which is nice, but there was a lot of
Mm-hmm.
fun, exciting, like novel energy in the beginning, which I really just kind of went hard with.
Mm-hmm.
I think you and I met at a bunch of like events and, I was just
Yep.
thirsty for more connection around it.
It's true. At the beginning, when you first realize, I think a lot of us go through that process. Like, I need to learn everything I can about it. I want to be in communities. Like, finally, this part of me gets to be seen and understood. Was that
Mm.
your experience as well?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it felt very vulnerable too. So you're
Mm.
wanting to connect with people about
Mm-hmm.
it. And it's almost like these people, like I remember it's like, oh, I found a nugget about myself, this little like golden, treasure piece. And then like here, and other people have it too. And we can talk about it. And like,
Yeah.
so it felt really special. It still does. But
Mm-hmm.
I remember in the beginning, it was all kinds of exciting.
It is exciting. I remember it too. I was
Yeah.
also in grad school and I learned
Right.
about it, and it was like my whole world just opened up. You talked about it being vulnerable. I'm curious about that. I haven't heard you say that before.
Oh, well, I think there's probably like, hmm, what's vulnerable about it? Yeah, because I think there's something about like maybe you're opening up yourself to questions, criticism.
Mm-hmm.
If someone doesn't know about the trait, maybe they're eye rolling at you or trying to prove you wrong, so to speak. But yeah, you're like opening up to people about like, hey, I have this trait, and here's what that
Mm-hmm.
means. And I don't know, we live in a world where the word sensitive can be so stigmatized, right?
Mm-hmm.
That a lot of people equate it as, as being something weak. So when you're
Yeah.
claiming like I'm a sensitive person, like,
Mm.
depending on where you are, that you can't really always gauge with the reactions of like folks when you open up
Mm-hmm.
in that way. So I guess that's that vulnerability, right? You're kind of inviting
Mm-hmm.
people into your sensitivity, and you don't always know how they're going to take it.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, we often work so hard to hide away our sensitivity, and now it's the opposite. You're like, here it is on front and center. So yeah, you really
Yeah.
are vulnerable. I haven't really thought about it that way, but it's so true when you start to make that process of unearthing your sensitivity and starting to share it with people. Be a little
Yeah,
dangerous if the response is not a safe one.
right. Maybe that's what the exciting part about trying to find community is, because you're
Mm.
like, oh, you're wanting not to feel like you're the only one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I'm curious before, actually, I'm wondering how did you get to the podcast, right? So what happens before? What puts you on that path of I'm seeking this out? Because for me, I was seeking out, but looking at parallels, but parallels with introversion because I was trying to figure out who am I, what is it, and that wasn't explaining everything about me.
Hmm.
And then just talking with people, that information, Dr. Elaine Aron's book made its way into my hands. But what was that process like for you? What were you seeking, or what were you trying to figure out about yourself when you landed on that Alanis' podcast?
Well, so there's a little bit of bias because I've like been an Atlantis fan since I was like a child.
Uh huh.
So there's that. But
Yeah.
no, but I think at the time I have always been being a psychotherapist is not my first career. There's been a
Mm.
couple of like other things that I've tried.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying career is weird, but like
Yeah.
other hats I've worn prior.
Right.
And but I noticed that when I came to going back to school to study clinical psychology, that um I was traveling once backpacking and got just leaving a career and didn't know what I was going to do next, didn't know who I was and what I was doing with my time on this planet.
Mm-hmm.
And I was reading some book while traveling with a friend, and it was really getting you to investigate like what were some of the through lines and all of the things that you've been interested in. And for me, there was this like through line around this interest or this hunger around the human
Mm.
experience and um, finding the common denominator between everybody and yeah, so it led me to um well, I guess what I'm trying to say is I've always been interested in psychology. So
Mm-hmm.
I guess a podcast like that was kind of something that's, I would listen to. And
Mm-hmm.
I was in grad school at the time. So I think there was just a thirst for more knowledge. And,
Yeah.
I had a professor once say that all research is me search. And I think there's
Mm.
a part of
That's
us
so
that
true.
like looks for ourselves in things we're interested in studying. So I don't think it's accidental that you hear this thing and then, it
Yeah.
um, kind of overcomes you. I can't think of a less violent metaphor than hits you in the face, but like,
It's
yeah, it really
true.
just you kind of like awoke me. Versus there's other things I've listened to where I'm like, oh, I don't really see myself in that, but I see the
Mm.
value in that. But there's something about this that I remember feeling like I could pinpoint a lot of what the traits were in my life. Like I could go back and
Mm.
I'm like, oh, this makes sense, or this makes sense as how this applies to me as it relates to like how I show up in relationships, how I show up in relationship to work, to
Mm-hmm.
you know, um, stimulation and time. Like just so much
Mm.
started to make sense.
Yeah, it's like for me, it's like the light switch got turned on.
Yeah,
Like
I like that.
everything became clear. You kind of have to go back and almost rewrite your story a bit through this new
Yeah,
information.
I think that's also a big piece about working with HSPs and mental health. It's like some of that work is like going back and kind of it's
Mm-hmm.
almost like you get to put a new filter on your life. And if you look at
Mm-hmm.
it through this lens, how does this start to make sense in a different way where,
Yeah.
um, yeah, like maybe some of the things you went through or some of the things you endured feel different if you know you're a highly sensitive kid or a highly sensitive
Mm-hmm.
young person. It just can hold different meaning and hopefully a more positive one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
Yeah.
like the metaphor of that through line. And when you listen to that interview, it's like, oh, sensitivity is one of my through lines.
Mm. Yeah. Oh, it's funny. I've never thought of it that way, but that actually makes a lot of sense.
Mm.
Yeah, I guess it is. Yeah, no, I mean, I can, you I got the sense that there was something different about me as a kid, that
Mm-hmm.
something that the world around me, and not knocking the environment that I grew up in, but you know, thinking that I don't know that the people around me were really equipped
Yeah.
to handle me in a way like
Mm-hmm.
and I think in my family, there's a kind of one size fits all approach, and I just
Mm-hmm.
don't think that was the approach with me. And I was just starved for like this different type of connection.
Mm-hmm.
I just kind of saw things differently and wanted to talk about things in a very different way, or I don't
Mm-hmm.
know. I mean, it's one story, it's funny about a reframe that this is so much when you go back into the past, like a lot of forgiveness. I used to have this belief or this narrative about me that I used to get lost a lot when I was little. So I always had this like way that it was painted for me was that like, oh, I was irresponsible. I was like,
Mm-hmm.
would wander off. And so I
Yeah.
held that for years. Gosh, like, like I was a bad kid.
Right.
Then I really realized what had happened is that like, we'd be in these crowded places and my attention would take me towards something that would catch my interest and just deep like fascination. And then I would get
Right.
lost because I'd lose who I was with. But then I remember thinking, wait, that wasn't my job. I was 4 years
Oh,
old. That I'm
that's
not in
true.
charge. Yeah. So I started to look at that as like, I didn't get lost. You lost me. And it
Right.
just
Wow.
really, just being like, oh, I'm just a little kid with tons of wanderlust. Like, of course
Yeah.
I need to be looked after.
Yeah.
My interest is gonna take me somewhere. So, I mean, that's like one small example of like, oh, I've kind of um healed from that a little bit.
Yeah.
That
That's a
story about
powerful one.
myself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like you lost me. And you're right. As a kid, kids are curious already. We're taking in our world. But as an HSP, a little sensitive one, you're deep diving. You're immersing so deeply into every little thing around you. Of course, you're
Hmm.
going to forget
Yes.
to track what adult you're with.
Yeah, but it's funny, well, being a sensitive person now because of that experience,
Mm-hmm.
like it's really hard for me to watch like stories or narratives where kids get lost. Like it's just
Oh,
like I
sure.
remember I mean, it makes me laugh now, but like
Mm-hmm.
Finding Nemo or Finding Dory,
Oh,
watched it once,
sure.
can't really go go back there.
It's too
Yeah.
personal.
Yeah, it feels really personal. But yeah. But yeah, that was it. I just remembered that example just now. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Hmm.
That sounds like I think we often have this experience as sensitive people as kids where it's like we kind of get put into this box or this certain set of expectations about how to be, and we then start to disconnect from our sensitivity. Was that happening for you too? Do you feel like you lost connection with some of those parts of yourself?
Hmm.
That young curious Brian who would deep dive and
Yeah, I think so.
mm,
I think maybe you and I have talked about this before, where, or maybe I've expressed it and you've listened to me talk about this, where I think for me, really early on as a queer person,
mm-hmm.
sensitivity would get conflated or confused with like queer identity. So, like at a
Yes,
really
yeah.
young age, like something that felt gender atypical for a young
Mm-hmm.
person assigned male at birth, that like, oh, this is because you're queer, this is because you're gay,
Mm-hmm.
XYZ, where it's like those things have nothing to do with each other. So I feel like
Right.
as a sensitive person, there's this, just deep awareness of the environment around you and
Mm-hmm.
this want to self-protect. So I think
Yeah.
there's a part of me that's like, oh, because I don't want to be ostracized or stigmatized, I'm going to sort
Mm-hmm.
of hide or either hide some of these parts of myself or be so hyper achievement oriented or perfectionistic
Mm-hmm.
around them that if I'm going to indulge them, I'm going to be the best at them. So it kind of left, yeah, like this, okay, if I'm going to be creative and I want to act as a kid, I better be better than everybody.
The best.
Or if
Mm-hmm.
I'm, you know, these aren't things I'm wanting to pursue or bring to light, I'm going to really hide them.
Mm-hmm. So it's
Yeah.
all or nothing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Huh.
Ooh.
Well, I just feel like I was like, yeah, that's all that nothing type of thinking. It'll be that's great material for my therapist.
Everything is fodder for therapy,
Right,
right?
yeah, yeah. But just thinking about those like di those dichotomies, those
Yeah.
binaries start really early.
They do, don't they?
Yeah.
Oh wow. We've talked about this before, but I think it's so important that there does seem to be a lot of parallels with queer identity or LGBTQ plus identity and being highly sensitive. And like you
Hmm.
said, they're not directly correlated, right? There's no causation between the two, not that I know of.
Hmm.
And I know you've done more research on it. Uh, can we can we dive in and talk a little bit more about the parallels? You talked about, the self-protection piece, and I know we've talked a little
Yeah.
bit about like the coming out experience a bit as both like revealing those parts of yourselves.
Hmm.
What do you see as the parallels between these two parts of yourself?
Yeah. I feel like I can see where there's similarities, but
Mm-hmm.
I feel called to say like I don't think they're the same, right? I think they're very
Yeah.
different, specifically systemically, right? Like
Yep.
um, LGBTQ plus folks are like literally fighting for their lives at this
Literally.
time and
Right.
our country and then everywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I remember when I was in grad school and I was looking at parallels, I was like, okay, so no one studied. I had this hunch. I was like, I bet there's
Uh-huh.
more, highly sensitive LGBTQ plus people in the community, and I don't know. That's maybe some part of me wanted to prove that or something. Never did,
Mm-hmm.
uh, but in doing that, as you do research, you start to look to what's out there, and I just
Mm-hmm.
was looking at all of it and then looking at it side by side, and the things that stuck out to me maybe
Are
higher prevalence to experiencing more mental health challenges in both
mm-hmm.
communities. I know this to be more researched, but it's more anecdotal for HSP, but more research for LGBTQ plus folks that, being inclined to or using more psychotherapy services.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I got really interested to think about, okay, what does it mean to be both? Like, what does it mean to be a highly sensitive person and somebody in the queer community? Because
Mm-hmm.
as a highly sensitive person, you have differential susceptibility, which is how I like to distill it, is that you can feel the positive stuff, even more
Mm-hmm.
so than a non-highly sensitive
Mm-hmm.
person, but you can also experience the negative stuff even more
Yeah.
negatively than the non-highly sensitive person. So I imagine a queer person experiencing, social or familial ostracism, marginalization, stigma,
Mm-hmm.
what that must feel like as a sensitive person,
Yeah.
and getting really interested in how they might be impacted even more. So,
Mm-hmm.
because of these two things. But then on the flip side, because I don't want to just stay in the dark, there is that like, what is their capacity to feel queer joy, right? That like
Oh yeah.
community is going to mean that much more. Things
Mm-hmm.
like pride are going to feel that much more positive or beneficial or affirming. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, I thought about and continue to think about a lot is what is it like to have those two identities and um,
Mm-hmm.
what it could mean. What is the percentage of the population now? We think it's 20 to 30% be highly
Yeah.
sensitive. And I know that that number for LGBTQ plus folks is getting larger, but it's lower.
Mm-hmm.
And
It's
so thinking
lower.
about
Yeah.
like there are a lot more HSPs in the world than there are folks that are
Mm-hmm.
identifying as a part of the queer community.
Yeah. What what's important about that for you?
Maybe that like sometimes HSPs are not as that like one out of
Mm-hmm.
four, right? It's a
Yeah, one out of
minority, but it's
four. Yeah.
still a lot of people.
It's true.
Yeah.
Right. It's still
Yeah.
we make up a large percentage of the population
Yeah. So I
compared to
see
queer
that as
folks. Yeah.
there's more likelihood we're finding each other.
Yeah, it's
And
true.
it's not
Yeah.
something, that's kind of like picked out socially as
Mm-hmm.
something that is seen as bad or immoral or
Right.
less than.
Right.
There are ways in which it is, but not so, I guess, overtly where it's
Yeah.
not being legislated against, being criminalized,
Mm-hmm.
I I
Yeah,
don't want
not to
this
the
to
same
sound
degree.
like, yeah, or like, that you're not a target for in some ways.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, and thinking about too, like for people who are LGBTQ plus and highly
Mm-hmm.
sensitive, like,
Mm-hmm.
are there ways that I think you named it a while ago, sensitivity gets hidden, or is there permission
Mm-hmm.
to be sensitive? I think that
Yeah.
actually extends itself to a lot of different identities and
Mm-hmm.
races, genders, and sexualities. But like, how do we understand sensitivity? It sounds like, for me, I understand it's through a very specific lens. And are we
Mm-hmm.
not making room for a lot of the way sensitivity is expressed because we don't really
Mm.
study it in these other ways?
Mm.
How I've learned about um, being highly sensitive is through a lot of the literature and the scientific research,
Mm-hmm.
which I just have to understand is from a very specific lens, and that lens being
Yeah.
white, cisgender,
Yep.
heterosexual, more
Mm-hmm.
often than not, largely female lens.
Yep.
So we've understood sensitivity as expressed through those identities, right? That's how it's
Yes.
conceptualized. So
Mm-hmm.
we may not know that a person is highly sensitive because it doesn't look like it doesn't come in that
Right.
box.
Right.
And I remember inviting a colleague, a black colleague of mine, to one of our groups, and we had
Mm-hmm.
a debrief afterward. And she had said, I'd asked what her experience was like. And I don't remember verbatim what she said, but she sort of expressed, like, growing up sensitive, but, who has permission to be sensitive in these spaces?
Yes.
Does sensitivity look the same for her as it does for the other people in the
Mm-hmm.
group? And how is that is space being made for that? So it's like,
Yeah.
I remember having that conversation and it really struck me because it's like,
Mm.
yeah, we expect it to show up this way and we bond over the ways it shows up, but like it could be showing up in all these plethora of other ways, but we don't see it that way because we don't see it as this one thing.
Right. It's like
Yeah.
the I don't know, the surface area to bond over is very small because we're
Mm.
only seeing it through this one very specific lens.
Yeah.
White, cishet females. I mean, I guess that this is true of in a lot of different cases, right? With research and representation. You're seeing a
Right.
very specific lens, and, the HSP community is not immune to that. There's a lot
Right.
of work to be done to include intersectionality in our conversations and how the different ways that HSP or sensitivity is expressed in different communities or even different individuals, and that but we've only seen this one very specific way. And
Mm.
there's so many ways that sensitivity shows up, and we may not even be recognizing it. And then we're
Right.
missing opportunities to connect over it. Is what I hear you say.
Yeah, and it can be so, just thinking about it like from another lens, is that it can be so gendered where, I
Yeah.
know in my work with the cisgender males, right, we already know, I think you and I like kind of know this, the research and the
Mm-hmm.
how-tos really well, that we kind of know
Right.
that when people take the self-test,
Yep.
men tend to score lower
Right.
because a lot of the questions are sort of socialized in this way that's like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, there's how to explain it, like they don't answer um, in the affirmative for a lot of things. And
Right.
sometimes they're told, take the test, the
For
child test, and answer
children.
for it right. Because
Right.
so I even think about when I worked with highly sensitive men, where we think sometimes I think we're seen as this monolith, highly sensitive people, but like I've made more and more space for noticing that how sensitivity can actually show up as irritability, can actually show up as
Yes.
anger. And we think
Yes.
of it as a sort of soft, very
Yeah.
empathetic, very welcoming kind of gentle energy. And it's like, it
Right.
is, but it just
In
the
some
one
people,
way
it
we,
is.
yeah, right. And who's to say that that is not also highly sensitive? It's just, it's a way that the trait shows up. And like, I don't know, maybe there's more permission to express irritability for
Mm-hmm.
men or anger
Mm-hmm.
because that feels more, um, like there's more permission in order to like
Mm-hmm.
access that versus some of the other stuff.
Exactly. So that could be the representation of sensitivity for someone, which
Yeah.
if you looked at it on paper, you would never think that was sensitivity. Maybe that, let's say I'm just thinking of like a young boy who's sensitive and struggles with anger
Mm,
or irritability or even distraction or whatever it is. They're getting sent down an ADHD path. They're getting sent to anger management. They're not
mm.
getting sent to nervous system care and maybe learning about their emotions and appreciating, the all the layers of their experience. So
Yeah,
we just can get completely thrown off track.
right. Or maybe I know for some cultures too, like thinking about the one that I grew up in, like, or just
Mm-hmm.
like, does sensitivity show up as stoicness? Like, does it
Right.
show up as shutting down? Does it show up as, um, I don't even know what, right? There's just so many
Mm-hmm.
possibilities, and I feel like sometimes
Yeah.
we're only looking at a few.
Exactly. It's so
Yeah.
limited.
Hmm.
Yeah. Just want to offer. You mentioned, the community you grew up in, and you've made some references. Would you like to share more about that community or how sensitivity is treated in your community?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up, both my parents are from Mexican descent. So
Mm-hmm.
my dad's first generation, my mom's a couple generations
Mm-hmm.
Mexican American. So I don't know. I know that there's sort of, I don't have the whole story of sensitivity kind of thought out. I'm always constantly thinking back and looking at it, but I know that there is, which I don't think is that unfamiliar for a lot of folks, is that the expression of emotions is not something that was allowed, feeling
Yeah.
anything other than sort of like obedience or just putting a smile on your face. There wasn't a lot of room for expressing
Mm-hmm.
anything that wasn't agreeable. So,
Mm-hmm.
if I ever felt the call to cry, it wasn't something that was really like held with a lot of care, or it was, kind of suck it up
Mm-hmm.
mentality. I know specifically in my environment, it was immediate goes to where other people have it worse. So you kind of learn to invalidate that, like, okay,
Yeah.
if I take in the suffering of the world, I can't suffer. So
Mm.
yeah, it feels like it's a lot of really just kind of soldiering through. And I think
Mm-hmm.
about the immigrant experience and how much is it a part of my family's culture that like
Mm-hmm.
there is a part of just soldiering through, right? There,
Right.
you can't really stop and think and what might be seen as self-indulgent to navel gaze or look inward and do this stuff
Mm-hmm.
because we are thinking about how we're going to survive.
Right.
And I think that kind of just becomes, kind of intergenerationally passed on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When you said, who earlier you said who gets to lean into their sensitivity, who gets to express sensitivity, who gets to have a relationship with it,
Yeah. And I
who's
never thought of
available.
this, but maybe being, it's controversial. Just to say, like, is claiming being highly sensitive a privilege?
I would say it is.
Yeah.
I have
Yeah.
always thought that. It's a privilege.
Right.
We've been in community together, in
Yeah,
person and online. Who shows up there the most,
for sure. Yeah.
right?
No, I mean, it's very apparent to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even thinking about our own privileges, like our ability to
Mm-hmm.
say that, right? Even my
Absolutely.
ability to exist in some of these spaces because I pass
Mm-hmm.
as white, depending on
Mm-hmm.
who's
Right.
asking, or
Right.
or I pass as, I mean, I don't think this, but I pass as straight, whatever that means, like all these things
Right.
where, it's, um, yeah, I'm able to exist in these spaces because I don't
Mm-hmm.
stand out sometimes, which, you know, um, give or take the environment we're in.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, that those are going to be privileges, or just even being able to go to grad school, access
Right.
podcasts, all of these things, right? The access to knowledge and information.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, a lot of that is not available. And it just speaks to so much how much work we have to do in our HSP community. A lot of communities,
right.
but since that's our topic here, in our HSP community, to expand who gets to be in the community.
Yeah. I
And
think I've been
yeah.
thinking about that a lot in the last couple of
Mm-hmm.
years because I've had a little bit of disillusionment and in a
Mm-hmm.
way that maybe a lot of us have had a sort of reckoning where, I think for me and the highly sensitive person community, or maybe as it relates to therapists, because that's the community I have more proximity to, is,
Mm-hmm.
remember in May 2020, June of 2020, when sort of the Black Lives Matter is
Mm-hmm.
um really at a height again, and George
Mm-hmm.
Floyd gets murdered. Like I remember
Mm-hmm.
seeing in sort of communities and online and stuff that specifically amongst highly sensitive people, I'd hear things like, "Oh, I can't look at the news; it's too much," or I'm too
Yeah.
sensitive for this. And
Right.
I remember some of those conversations being really activating, and I won't get into some of the other things I saw and heard, but that
Mm-hmm.
like it's only recently dawned on me that I think sometimes because of um, I think sometimes these conversations that I think that fragility can get confused for sensitivity.
Yes.
And sometimes, when people, even work with people are like, oh, I can't do this. Not saying you need to look at the news all the time, but that like
Mm-hmm.
being able to look away from some of these issues is a privilege. And there's
Yes,
some
it
of us
is.
that can't. So
Mm-hmm.
when I go to these community events and it's a sea of, predominantly white faces,
Mm-hmm.
while it may not always be intentional, I don't think it's accidental.
Ooh. Say
Yeah.
more.
Yeah, that like, someone may not have been intending to do that, but I don't think like if someone was putting intention and mindfulness and trying to create impact, I don't think
Mm-hmm.
they would just end up as, all the same identities,
Yeah.
cis white het people.
Right.
But I still see that. I'll see these like, hey, come to this, highly sensitive retreat, and it's just the
Yep.
same catalog of folks. And like, I just
Yep.
like, come on, like I know we're out there, right? Like I know
We're
there's
out
other folks
there.
out
Yeah.
there, and I just, I feel like getting on the soapbox here, but I think making more of these spaces inclusive is
Mm-hmm.
raising, Black, Indigenous voices of color, and that takes effort, and it is
Mm-hmm.
uncomfortable, and you have to,
Mm-hmm.
lean into that. But I
Yeah.
think that's where, I don't know, I can't speak for other folks, but I know the work can be uncomfortable, but I think
Mm-hmm.
that's where that fragility piece comes in. It's like out there, but just like thinking about the work we have to do to make spaces more welcoming.
Absolutely. You're right that the fragility piece does get confused with sensitivity, and it can be, I don't know if I want to say an excuse, but the go-to response, like, I just can't do it. And
Mm,
I think we're actually selling ourselves short as highly sensitive people because we are actually very resilient,
yeah.
right?
Mm, I love that.
We have a lot to bring to the table, and everyone suffers if we disengage because we are the seers, right? We are the canaries in the coal mine, so to speak,
Mm.
right? So we
Yeah.
need to keep our eyes open. Now, I don't think it's sustainable to keep our eyes open in the way modern media operates. Like you said, you don't have to see everything all the time, but do take in what's happening, at least
Yeah.
at some level, in a
Right.
digestible way, instead of just turning off completely. Yeah, I think it's important to stay engaged, but figure out how you can do that.
Yeah. I remember attending a virtual workshop that our colleague Sydney James did. I
Mm-hmm.
think it was titled um, Being Highly Sensitive While Black.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm sorry, Sydney, if I'm not getting the title of that workshop right. It was a couple of years ago, but something that stood out to me that's so useful was like, as a highly sensitive person, she had said, and paraphrasing, when it comes to sort of activist pursuits, like, what's within our capacity. And I get that,
Mm-hmm.
you're honoring sensitivity, but,
Yeah.
and maybe it is about figuring out what is in our capacity. I mean, does inviting, searching for more people to be in our community feel like that's within our capacity? And like that feels, you know, doable.
I would hope
And
so.
yeah, it could also be, um, I think about like, I guess this works for every space in general, but
Mm-hmm.
just the content we're consuming, who are the voices that we're listening to? I think about something for me personally that I've been doing is just like I don't when it comes to any personal reading, I don't read books by white authors anymore.
Mm-hmm.
If I do read a book by a white author, they're usually LGBTQ plus.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about like, going into book clubs, am I, making space
Yeah.
for content written by other
Mm-hmm.
voices of color, just things like that. I mean, those are just small to me, very digestible ways that activism can show up that as a
Yeah.
sensitive person feels within my capacity. Are there
Mm-hmm.
times that I'm on the street in a protest? Sure. Is that all the time? No. But, do I
Right.
want to be there? Hell yes. But I also, and I don't know. I imagine this is the same for you because I think you and I are
Mm-hmm.
very aligned in our values. But like, I
Mm-hmm.
think as a therapist, a lot of my activism shows up there.
Oh
And I
yeah.
think a lot of the conversations you and I are having are the conversation I'm having with the clients who come and see me.
Yep.
And I'm very upfront about that. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, I guess in that way, for me, the personal and the political aren't really separate.
Yeah, and you bring up such a good point that there are accessible ways to move the needle as
Mm,
sensitive people, right?
yeah,
We're not always going to be on the front lines. That's not what we're really wired for.
yeah.
Um, I was on the front lines a lot in my 20s, but now in my 40s, not so much.
Right. Yeah. You gotta also honor your body and where you
Exactly,
are. Right. So
right?
true.
But you're
Yeah.
right that there are ways. So being mindful and intentional about what you consume, books,
Mm.
media, what workshops you participate in, who you reach out to for
I
information.
think I remember reading in God, it's probably behind me somewhere. Yeah, it's right there. The highly sensitive person book. There is like in the second chapter, like a list of
Mm-hmm.
attributes, and one of them is like, oriented towards social justice and conscientiousness. And I remember thinking, oh my God, we're all the same. We're all like these,
Yeah.
people are just uh like these things are so important to us. And I catch myself. I may make this error. It's a human error where I think
Mm-hmm.
we're all created the same. Like HSPs, I used
Mm-hmm.
to think we're a monolith, and I know now we're not. But that like we
Right.
still can be oriented towards those things, but like they may show up
Mm-hmm.
differently, and we are very much products of our culture, so we're
Mm-hmm.
very impacted by that. But I guess thinking about that, I imagine what I'm trying to get to is that I think HSPs can be really powerful critical thinkers, and where
Mm-hmm.
better than to think critically than about all of these like issues that relate
Yeah.
to equity and equality and
Mm-hmm.
diversity and inclusiveness. So I think our minds are very useful here.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, and so maybe it is important. I love to use that word. It's like how do we call upon our resilience in these times?
Mm-hmm. I mean, needed more than ever,
Mm, yeah.
right? And I think it's a tragedy because I think a lot of times we fall victim to the fragility, to the overwhelm,
Hmm.
and all of the reasons we're here. Because I mean, Elaine Aaron talks about this a lot. We have an evolutionary purpose for being highly
Hmm.
sensitive. It's not just random by accident, but we believe that we don't have value,
Mm,
or we believe that we're just doomed to feel overwhelmed all the time, and we just can't engage in the world. And that's a big problem because we do have a purpose. The healers, the seers, the decision makers, right? The critical
mm,
thinkers. We have a lot to offer. So do other people, the non-HSPs as well. It's a complement.
right.
It's a
Yeah.
partnership.
Symbiotic,
It's
yes.
symbiotic,
Yeah,
exactly,
yeah.
exactly. But
Yeah.
but I think we need to recognize that, like own our worth as sensitive people, and also tolerate sensitivity showing up in different ways,
Yeah.
right, and in different forms. It's not just
Mm.
one thing, which we've been led to believe. I think.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what's the word I want to use here? I don't feel like um, there's a word I want for like I'm getting towards conspiracy territory,
Uh
but
huh.
because I guess the parts of me that get like cynical or really curious is like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, is it accidental that like in a world filled with more stimulation and more
Mm-hmm.
technology that we're more exhausted and we're unable to
Mm-hmm.
detach from phones? I don't think that's always accidental.
Yeah.
So what I mean by that is that like, yeah, like we're feeling more depleted than ever.
Yeah.
We're feeling capitalism has us all drained and
Mm-hmm.
in competition constantly. Just I think we're all in chronic over arousal,
Absolutely.
so now we're grappling with all these sort of struggles around attention
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
social stuff. And you know it's my way of saying that I also think sometimes this isn't our fault. It's also a product of the world we live in too, which makes it really
Mm-hmm.
hard to be can make it harder for sensitive folks to kind of muster the energy when we're like, I hear a lot of sensitive people just like can see
Yeah.
being sensitive as this debilitation
I
because it's just
know.
I'm always fried, and it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, it can seem that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, what do if that was one of your clients or one of your friends, and they're saying, "I'm always fried. I can't do anything." What do you say
Mm,
in response to that? Because I want to have empathy, and I also want to empower that person personally. I'm just curious what your approach would be.
yeah. Well, I think I would validate the hell out of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, yes, yes,
Right.
yes, yes, and
Mm-hmm. Yes,
um,
and.
but yeah, just making like, okay, so I think this is a conversation we have often is like, what feels possible? What is within
Mm-hmm.
your capacity?
Mm-hmm.
I'm hearing there are parts of you that want to make a difference or want to help. Like,
Yeah.
how do we honor those parts? Make room for them while also honoring the parts of you that are sensitive, that are tired, that are feeling kaput in some way,
Mm-hmm.
and or, taking stock of, I think sometimes when we talk with highly sensitive people, one of the sort of tenets is like living a lifestyle that's congruent with your trait. So maybe we got to look at some of the stuff
Yeah.
you're participating in. Is that like,
Mm-hmm.
is that sustainable? Is your job sustainable? Is
Right.
your, I can think of a lot of things, relationship, all of these
Mm-hmm.
things that are these sustainable, or are these also things that are, stealing a lot of gas from your engine, so to speak.
Mm. What a great metaphor. Yeah.
Yeah. I like to think a lot about, which is so funny because we're talking about technology, talking with HSPs is like you have a phone battery. Every day it starts, if you're
Exactly.
lucky, it charged overnight and you got 100, but
Yep.
that thing needs to be recharged, right? And like
Exactly.
certain things are going to take out more juice than the other. And are you actually, that's
Right.
something we come back to. Are you recharging your battery? And
Mm-hmm.
are you going to go to this party or this work event on a
Mm-hmm.
10%? You're in the red.
Right.
It's probably not going to be at your best then.
Yeah, you're not. I
Yeah.
I always think though about, is recharging also a privilege?
True. True. Yeah, mic drop there. That was good. Yeah, it is. I think it can be. Well, because
Yeah.
there's this whole thing where sometimes, I even now when I say the phrase self-care, I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
like a part of me like irks a little because I'm like, that feels very privileged. That became
Yeah.
so popular in culture for a little while, and now it feels like does what people were describing as self-care, like if, I'm totally generalizing, but they're like,
Mm-hmm.
get a massage, get a facial, go to therapy, do these things. And I just think
Right.
about how much money each of those things cost. And
Exactly.
yeah,
Right.
is,
But I think what you're also saying is what is in your control within what you have available? Is that what I hear you
mm,
saying? Like
yeah,
it's not
yeah.
about going to the fancy spa or getting a massage or taking off work for a vacation, but can you make small choices even throughout the day within what's in your control?
Yeah, lifestyle shifts,
Yeah.
this phrase that's been, you know, uh, coming into my mind a lot in the work is, thinking about breaking patterns. And
Mm.
yeah, where there's
Yeah.
certain patterns here that we can break to make some changes. I just think about like when someone goes through something and maybe they've gotten on the other side of that challenge. I think about like, are there reserves of energy that are available because that
Mm-hmm.
thing is now behind you? Um,
Yeah.
you
Right.
know, um,
Mm.
yeah, just thinking about, yeah, just how we take care of ourselves and all of this, or just, yeah, when everything feels so
Mm-hmm.
hard. Yeah, I struggle with that too. There's a voice in my head that says, well, you would, what would be available to you if you just got off social media? And I don't feel like I'm like, have the most egregious habits, but I'm human.
Mm.
I'm on it hours a day. And um, that feels hard for me because there's a part of me that feels like I'm going to lose connection to what's going on. And I feel like that's really important
Right.
from an activist perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But I know as a therapist, if I would be telling myself like, doesn't mean we can't have some boundaries. It doesn't mean
Right.
we can't have some
Exactly.
like,
Right.
limitations. And I know that we all
Yeah.
could benefit from stuff like that, these little shifts and
Yeah.
breaking of the pattern. So
Exactly.
there's a way for me to still connect it and find out information on the ground without having to
Mm-hmm.
be in it 8 hours a day.
Exactly. Yeah, we're like breaking patterns in small ways, but also in like more impactful ways too on a larger
Yeah, I like
scale.
that.
Yeah, all over
Right.
the place.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
Mhm.
So if you could share one message with HSPs who are, trying to shift those patterns, whether it's internally or on a bigger scale, and they're looking for a community, what would you share? What would the message be?
Mm, yeah. This question around community, it feels like such a a
Hmm.
big theme. I feel like globally right now, and it feels like in
Mm-hmm.
my work, it feels like this comes up a lot with folks. Like
Yeah.
where is community? How do we find it? Where is
Yes.
it created and fostered? And
Mm-hmm.
I'm speaking of being online, I'm so privy to articles about like people writing from this perspective of how the social has changed in the
Mm-hmm.
pandemic, or like people spending more time on their own, or community spaces having shifted away. So I feel like it's not easy. I know
Yeah.
that it's something that I'm figuring that out for myself. Like
Mm-hmm.
I've had a lot of my friends move away, and
Mm-hmm.
because of my values and my views, some of my relationships don't fit my life anymore. And, there's just lots of grief. I think we're all navigating some of that.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess maybe for HSPs, like finding community around other HSPs, I think that's also one of the tenets, right, of the
It
HSP
is. Yeah.
care, right? Like
Yes.
be around other HSPs. And I think that's really great.
Mm-hmm.
It can be hard. I think as we're
Mm-hmm.
waiting for more things to come back in person in vivo, um,
Mm-hmm.
it might be hard to find a HSP branded thing or organized thing. But I think sometimes like if we're only looking for other highly sensitive people, we may sort of like lose out on the opportunity to just deeply connect with people who are just good people or make us feel
Exactly.
a way about ourselves. So I would
Mm-hmm.
say, trying to surround yourself with people who, honor those sensitive parts of you, the deep thinking, the conscientious, maybe, I'm saying this with kind of humor, the neurotic parts of you, if you call that,
Yeah,
that,
right.
like the overthinking parts, all these things that like,
Mm-hmm.
there are probably people out there in your life or maybe could be in your life that just make you feel good and make you feel like
Mm-hmm.
seen and connected. And they don't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily have to be highly sensitive, but
Mm-hmm.
or identify as an HSP, but doesn't mean we shouldn't appreciate and honor and invite those people into our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some of the old, older tried ways of like finding people that align with your interests can be a way or access to that. And
Mm-hmm.
I will say though, it does take time and investment because you may want to go to something once and say, I didn't connect with anyone there. And I was like, community takes
Yeah.
time and it takes
Mm.
consistency. And
Yes.
um, it may take showing up to a place repeatedly until
Mm-hmm.
someone, as a sensitive person, if you're introverted, it may take courage to
Yeah.
walk up to someone, and it may not happen the first time you meet them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So those are my thoughts lately about, you know, socializing and building community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
Yeah.
appreciate that. The reminder that community does take time, and it's okay to give yourself permission to slowly ease in, especially if you're a more
Mm,
sensitive introvert, or you're figuring out the spaces you feel most comfortable in, or where you might find people like yourself.
yeah. Well, I think, articles read were written where like, maybe places like churches or like schools where or
Mm-hmm.
working in person, which I know has changed for some folks from
Right.
working from home or being remote, if that's something you can do, or maybe you're in spaces with people more consistently and that's how community can form. But
Yeah.
um maybe I notice adults have challenges building friends because we lose some of those things from the earlier years of just like
Mm-hmm.
frameworks of communities that are already like in place for us.
Right. It's true. We don't have as much built in as we used
Mm,
to,
yeah,
especially as things start to change and go more online, or
right.
yeah, you're working more remotely.
Yeah. Not that I was ever making friends in grocery stores or anything, but like or restaurants, but like everything's deliverable
Right, it's true.
now.
The chances are even lower though.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
But I did want to highlight what you said around, especially if, let's say, you don't fit the typical HSP mode,
mm,
that it's more about how you feel with someone. Like, do you feel seen and connected, and you can
mm.
really show up and feel safe? That's more important than the person identifies as an HSP. It's
Yeah.
more, can your sensitive part show up? Can your whole self show up?
Mm. Um, yeah, in this little anecdote that when I do present on like or a couple of conferences I've done, and we'll talk about personal stories to make the very science heavy stuff relatable,
Mm-hmm.
is yeah, it's interesting. This person who's a family friend ended up just passing away. I think it was last year, but I remember being a really young kid, maybe the age of like between the ages of like 9 through my teenage years. But we had a family friend that would constantly either pick me up or me and some of my siblings up to go to the movies. And I, as a kid, just was obsessed with everything related to cinema. Like,
Mm-hmm.
so what I went to undergrad for the first time, like it just,
Mm-hmm.
still in love with movies, just love them and just love talking about them. Like most of my HSP sensitivity parts come out around this because
Mm-hmm.
I talk about it deeply. After I go to the film, I'm thinking about it for days. I'm reading reviews.
Yeah.
Like I just process so deeply and I love it. But this person used to take me to I think it was just me to be like, oh, we're gonna go to the movies. You want to come with us? And would just
Mm-hmm.
love to hear me talk and would
Oh, I love
ask
that.
me my opinions on something and was like,
Mm.
oh, this is coming out. We want to take you to see it. And I just remember being like, oh, that was the one place where it was just about me. I'm one of
Mm.
5 kids. So like it
So
was
it
just
didn't
about
happen too
me. And it's
often.
like, yeah, and it was like this person really connects and appreciates
Mm.
this side of me. And I think that person, whether they knew it or not, and I remember seeing them. shortly before they passed, and I had such gratitude because I remember that through the framework of my sensitivity that this person was such a
Mm,
positive figure for me. And
yeah.
it didn't look like, what we think it looks like, but it's just I had this deep connection with this person.
Yeah.
And, it's kind of a life raft, when I was a kid.
Well, yeah, I mean, they saw something in you and then they nourished it.
Yes, that's a
So
beautiful way of saying it.
beautiful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
nourished it for sure. And just, I didn't feel any shame or otherness around it.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I think
Cuz
it really impacted me in a really great way.
yeah, I can tell you were just lighting up
Yeah,
as you were telling me about
I
that. It's
know.
so sweet.
Yes, yeah, it's a
Oh,
good memories.
I love that. Yeah, so going more leaning into those people that do give you nourishment, that give you that life raft, that help you feel seen, regardless of how they identify or if they're sensitive or not. It's more about how do you feel when you're with them. I think that's really
Yeah.
important. Yeah.
And if we don't have those people in our lives currently, or maybe,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, then, it can maybe the inviting the intention into, creating spaces
Mm-hmm.
for those people, or creating spaces for those relationships because I think they're important.
Mm-hmm. They're very important. Yeah.
Yeah. I've heard, I think I in the HSP community when, lockdown happened around the
Mm-hmm.
pandemic, I remember hearing people say, "Yay, I love it." Like, I don't have to
Yep.
deal with people. And I think that didn't last very long
Mm-mm. It
because
didn't.
we're all social creatures. We need
Mm-hmm.
people to survive. Like we die in isolation.
Yeah.
So like even introverts need people, right? And so
Absolutely.
I just say that and like saying that just a reminder that like yes, well, alone time and downtime is so valuable to the
Mm-hmm.
HSP, but people are just as valuable.
Mm-hmm. People are just as valuable, and
Yeah.
it's not that we needed less people. I think it's we needed more decompression, more
Mm.
downtime,
Hmm.
and we got that. And now it's like, well, where's the community?
Yeah, right.
Now I need to go. Yeah, I need to lean in back to that. Yeah.
Yeah, I see us all trying to like. I mean, it could be just my projection on it, but I feel like I'm seeing people trying to learn to walk again. As it like as like how are we social again?
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah. It's like we're
yeah,
reacclimating and learning it for the first time almost, and
yeah.
needing to build systems back up for a community
Mm-hmm.
as if they never existed in the first place.
You're right.
It feels hard.
It does. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
it does. And then then you're tired all the time. Right. It's just yeah. Right. It's difficult.
Exactly, it is.
Yeah.
It is. And hopefully we can start to shift that, but I think what we're saying is like, where can we take it some initiative
Yeah. Yeah.
and maybe create spaces that we want to have around in the world.
Mm.
Um, yeah, and our with our little bits of energy left over.
Right. Yes, yes, yes. Yeah.
Brian, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Hmm. No final thoughts. I think I mean something that I don't know if it's worth mentioning that I guess when people are just coming to understand the trait, like I remember for me there
Mm-hmm.
was this energy of it's like it felt very urgent.
Yes.
And I think you had asked me before we talked about like, what's changed in your relationship to sensitivity. And I thought
Mm-hmm.
about that and I was like, yeah, it doesn't feel as urgent, which is nice because there's like a sort of it feels like it's integrated away in a
Mm-hmm.
way. And the practice of being a highly sensitive person just feels like an imperfect practice. And it
Mm-hmm.
just like, and what I mean by that is that like I did a lot in my life to sort of honor the lifestyle or honor the trait
Mm-hmm.
in a way that feels compatible. And
Mm-hmm.
but sometimes I don't get it perfect. Sometimes I'm overwhelmed and I'm irritated
Yeah.
because I didn't do all the things I was supposed to. But like with this knowledge, I think a lot of it feels a little bit more seamless. Like things like
Mm.
for me, like transitions are so important, but now they're just like baked into everything. Like
Ooh.
it's automatic in a
Uh-huh.
way that maybe in the past I would question it. Now it's like it is non-negotiable most times. but I
Yeah.
don't think about it anymore because I'm like, that's just the way I operate
It's part
now.
of your life.
Yeah, so it feels like, yeah, and it doesn't feel so urgent because it's just like I
Mm-hmm.
just don't push it in the way that I used to.
Yeah, I'm curious. I think I know what you mean when you say you've kind of baked in some transitions, but I'm curious if you could give an example of that
Yeah,
for someone
I
who's
love this. I
maybe
love
who
this.
doesn't know.
The I think it's such a great example of talking about how early do you arrive to the airport?
Yes.
Or something. It can be airport, substitute event,
Right.
substitute thing, right? Like, and
Yeah.
but I noticed, like, you in relationships, like, why there are often one person who likes to get there an hour before, and I'm the person that just like I want to get there 3 hours before.
Same.
I love to, oh, I don't want to wait around. I'm like, that's great. I love to go look for a
I love it.
magazine and waste money on candy, like things I don't need. I'm like, that is a part of the journey. Like, but
Yes.
it's also because I know for me, I'm
Mm-hmm.
not my best self or in my highest self, or my nervous system doesn't feel regulated when I'm rushing. And that
Yes.
is through everything. Like even before we signed on today, like I
Mm-hmm.
was grateful that I had an hour. I
That's nice.
thinking about it even early this morning.
Yeah.
It's been on my mind. It's like it's going to be very
Yes.
gentle as I come in. I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
just be in the seat, as they say, to be ready. And so I
Yeah.
just feel like that is just such a practice. I leave time before appointments, before
Mm-hmm.
getting anywhere. It's just, but I've always done that, and now I'm just giving myself more permission to just be that way.
Yeah.
And some people comment on it, and now I just don't care as much.
Uh-huh. Because you're living it, right? You see how good it is for your nervous system.
Yeah, and I think other people benefit from it. I will
They
say,
do. Yes.
they really do, and they pretend they don't, but they do. They benefit
They
from like I'm a
do.
planner, that I'm, thinking
Exactly.
ahead, worrying a little more than maybe most folks, but
Exactly. I mean,
yeah.
and I love getting to the airport early too. It's like baked in slowing down time.
Oh
That's
yeah.
everything else just shuts off. You're at the airport. You can't do anything else.
I'm packing for a trip like 5 days before mentally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and
Absolutely.
I mean those are just like small ways it shows up, and just but yeah, like I think
Mm-hmm.
for me transitions have always been a cornerstone of um sensitivity for me, but I think they are for a lot of neurodivergent folks too. So
Yeah, agreed. Just
yeah.
having that space to kind of integrate in and then move out. It's so important, right? Because you there's so much processing that happens.
Yeah,
You need
yeah,
to, like you said, bake in time for that. It's such a good example too. Like those things that feel maybe out of reach or other people just don't understand or push back on, eventually they become second nature.
yeah,
Like I'm
yeah.
the same way. I like to have a lot of time between things.
Hmm.
And it's so important. And yes, do I maybe do less or I cram less into the day? Yes, but I'm more balanced at the end.
Yeah. I also think I want to honor good old age too. I've also
Yes, that too.
just like think that's also
It's
natural
true.
too, that like there was
Right.
more that I was willing to endure. But it's funny, I think
Yeah.
Elaine Aron even talks about that in one of the books, pointing out that like maybe
Mm-hmm.
you don't notice sensitivity in your earlier years because you're just the call of of age is like much more
Yes.
out and stimulating, and
Right.
it we all kind of maybe hit a shift sometimes, or
Yeah.
like a yeah, like a oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
That definitely happened to me.
Me too. It's true because like in your teens and 20s, you're primed for socializing and like
Yeah.
mating and all of those like really deep instinctual urges. And yeah, those aren't present as you age. So it
Yeah.
makes sense that then the sensitivity shifts a bit.
Yeah.
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 Hmm.
No, that was the only thing I think that was left in my mind
Oh,
as we were
it's
talking.
important. Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Well, Brian, thank you so much for this conversation. I really appreciate it. Um, if folks want to find out more about you, where can they do that?
Yeah. My website, you can find out or just reach out to me there. It's
Mm-hmm.
my first name and my last name, so briantorrestherapy.com. Kind of just where everything is.
Perfect.
Yeah, that's probably the easiest way to
Great.
get in
And
touch.
I'll include a link for folks.
Yeah.